There is a pattern so consistent, so mathematically precise, that it cannot be called coincidence. A country finds gold, or oil, or bauxite, or copper. The ground beneath its people's feet holds generational wealth. And then, almost without exception, the same sequence follows. External partners arrive. Contracts are signed. Debt is taken on. Institutions send advisors. And the nation, despite everything it sits on, is told to wait. Wait for growth. Wait for stability. Wait for conditions to improve. Wait for the next review cycle. Wait for the next tranche of funding. Wait. The question this documentary asks is not whether that delay is real. The delay is real. The question is whether it is accidental, or whether it is the product of a logic so deeply embedded in global financial architecture that most governments never even see it for what it is. This is not about blaming one institution or one country. It is about reading a system the way an auditor reads a ledger. Carefully, line by line, without sentiment. Because when you do that, when you actually follow the money instead of the press releases, what you find is not chaos. What you find is order. A very precise, very durable order that consistently advantages the lender and consistently delays the sovereign. Let us begin with the concept of conditionality. When the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank extends a loan or a structural support package to a developing nation, the money does not arrive without instructions. This has been widely documented across decades of economic literature, government reports, and post-program assessments. The instructions are called conditions. They are sometimes called reforms. The institution frames them as technical guidance, necessary steps to ensure fiscal stability so that the borrowing country can eventually repay and grow. On paper, that logic sounds reasonable. A lender wants to know the borrower can pay back. Of course. But look more carefully at what the conditions actually require, and a pattern emerges that is worth sitting with. Conditionality in its most common form has historically included the reduction of government subsidies, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the liberalization of trade, the removal of capital controls, and the contraction of public spending, particularly on social programs. These are not random technical preferences. They are a specific philosophy about how an economy should be organized. And that philosophy, when applied consistently to resource-rich nations in the global South, tends to produce a very particular outcome. It opens the country's most valuable sectors to foreign ownership at precisely the moment the country is most financially vulnerable to negotiate. Think about what that means in practice. A country that has just endured a currency crisis or a debt default is not negotiating from a position of strength. It is negotiating at the bottom. And at the bottom, you take the terms you can get. You sign the contracts that are in front of you. You sell the concessions that need to be sold. And because the conditions attached to the lifeline you just received require you to liberalize and privatize, the contracts you sign tend to favor the party with capital, which is almost never the sovereign government of the borrowing nation. This is the bank logic that delays sovereignty, not malice necessarily. Not a room full of conspirators, a system, a set of assumptions baked into financial instruments that consistently reproduce a specific power relationship. The nation is the supplicant. The institution is the arbiter. The corporation is the beneficiary. And the people of that nation are left waiting for a prosperity that the structure was never designed to deliver to them. Let us look at how debt itself functions as a mechanism of delay. Debt is not neutral. This is worth saying plainly because the mainstream economic conversation often treats debt as simply a tool, useful when managed well, dangerous when mismanaged. But sovereign debt in the context of post-colonial economies carries a different weight. It carries history. And that history shapes what the debt actually does to a country's capacity for self-determination. Many nations in the Caribbean, in sub-Saharan Africa, in West Africa, in the Pacific Islands, entered the post-independence era already carrying the structural disadvantages of colonialism. Under-diversified economies, single commodity export dependencies, administrative systems built to extract rather than develop. And into that fragile moment, the international lending architecture arrived with money. Money that came with conditions, and conditions that deepened the very dependencies the countries were trying to escape. The debt does several things simultaneously. It constrains fiscal space. When a government is spending a significant portion of its national revenue on debt service, interest payments, principal repayments, that is money not being spent on education, infrastructure, agricultural development, or the kind of industrial policy that builds long-term economic capacity. The debt service obligation comes first. It is senior to everything. Before a school is built, before a road is paved, before a hospital is staffed, the lender gets paid. At the same time, the debt creates leverage for the ongoing imposition of conditions. As long as a country needs refinancing, as long as it needs debt restructuring, as long as it needs access to international capital markets, and most of these countries do need that access, because their own domestic capital markets are too shallow to finance large-scale development. The conditionality conversation never really ends. There is always a next review, always another negotiation, always another set of benchmarks to hit before the next tranche is released. And here is the quietly devastating part. Those benchmarks are almost never benchmarks for sovereignty. They are benchmarks for creditor confidence. They are designed to tell the lender that it is safe to keep lending. They are not designed to tell the nation whether it is closer to owning its own ports, its own mines, its own financial infrastructure. Economic sovereignty does not appear in the scorecard. It is not a deliverable. It is not a metric. And it is, if anything, viewed with suspicion, as a sign of instability, of protectionism, of unreliability as a borrowing partner. This is the contradiction buried at the center of the entire system. The very act of asserting ownership of a mine, of a contract, of a resource, can trigger exactly the financial penalty that drives a country back to the negotiating table in a position of weakness. Credit ratings drop, investor confidence falls, currency pressure increases. And suddenly, the government that tried to assert control over its own wealth is being told by every financial commentator, every credit agency, every foreign ministry, that it has destabilized its economy. The message is consistent. Sovereignty is premature. Wait. Stabilize first. Grow first. Liberalize first. Then, one day maybe, you can think about ownership. That day has a way of never quite arriving. Now. Let us be precise about who has named this pattern most clearly in recent years. When Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, stood before the United Nations and described a financial architecture that he said was designed to keep African nations dependent rather than sovereign, he was not inventing a new argument. He was articulating something that economists and historians had documented for decades. But he was articulating it from the position of a sitting head of state in the world's most prominent multilateral forum, and with the backing of a policy direction that was actually attempting to operationalize a different model. That is what made the statement significant, not the words alone. The words had been said before, In what was different was the attempt to act on them within a living economy, to actually renegotiate contracts, to redirect resource revenues toward domestic reinvestment, to question the terms under which foreign mining and extraction operations had been functioning. Whether every specific policy decision in that process was correct or optimal is a separate analytical conversation. But the underlying question, what would it look like to build an economy around sovereign ownership rather than creditor reassurance? That question is exactly the one that the Standard Development Finance Framework never seriously asks. And that gap between what the framework asks and what genuine economic sovereignty would require is where the delay lives. Let us go deeper into the mechanics of mining and extraction agreements, because this is where the bank logic becomes most visible at the ground level. When a multinational corporation signs a concession agreement with a government to extract minerals, gold, copper, bauxite, coltan, lithium, whatever the resource may be, the agreement sets out the terms under which the extraction happens. Royalty rates, tax treatment, profit repatriation rules, environmental obligations, local content requirements, duration of the concession, dispute resolution mechanisms. In many cases, and this is documented across jurisdictions in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, these agreements were signed during periods when the host government was either financially distressed, politically unstable, or simply lacked the technical, legal, and financial expertise to fully evaluate what it was agreeing to. Decades ago, in many cases, under different conditions, sometimes under governments that may not have had the long-term interest of their populations as the primary consideration. The agreements then run for 20, 30, 40 years. They contain stabilization clauses, provisions that effectively freeze the legal and tax environment for the corporation, so that even if the host country later passes laws that would normally apply to businesses operating within its borders, the corporation retains the benefit of the original terms. The sovereign parliament can pass a law. The mine does not have to comply with it. That is not a conspiracy. That is a clause in a contract. A clause that was agreed to. A clause that lawyers on both sides understood. But it is a clause that, when you look at who had the leverage at the time of signing and who had the technical capacity to understand its long-term implications, tells a story about how the delay gets legally embedded. And when a government later tries to renegotiate, to update the terms to reflect current market conditions or current national priorities, the response is often swift. The corporation activates the dispute resolution mechanism, usually international arbitration under rules that favor the investor. The country is sued, sometimes for amounts that dwarf its annual national budget. And the threat of that arbitration, even before a case is formally filed, is enough to deter many governments from trying. The delay does not require a single villain. It requires a legal architecture that was built by parties with capital, for parties with capital. See, and that consistently produces outcomes favorable to parties with capital. The sovereign is inside that architecture. The corporation is often outside it, protected from national law by the very contract the nation signed. This is the ledger that rarely gets read in public, not the GDP figures, not the foreign direct investment headlines, the actual contract, the stabilization clause, the royalty rate locked in 1987, the arbitration venue located 4,000 miles from the mine. Now here is the question that this analysis has to confront honestly. What would a different architecture look like? And is there any realistic path toward it, given how deeply the current system is embedded? The conversation around economic sovereignty is not simply nostalgic or ideological. It has a practical dimension that is increasingly being taken seriously by a range of economists, policy analysts, and development scholars who look at the evidence and conclude that the current model is not producing the outcomes it promises. The alternative framework, which figures like Ibrahim Traoré have represented symbolically, even if the execution in any specific context is contested, centers on a few core principles. First, the audit. Before any renegotiation can happen, a government needs to understand what it actually signed. What are the existing contracts? What do they require? What do they prevent? What revenues are flowing where? This sounds obvious. It is surprisingly rare. Many governments operate without a complete picture of their own asset base and their own contractual obligations. The first act of sovereignty is knowing what you own, what you owe, and what you gave away. Second, the renegotiation. Not necessarily the cancellation, that carries its own costs and risks, but the systematic renegotiation of terms where the evidence shows that the original agreement was unfair, or that conditions have changed sufficiently to warrant new terms. This is standard commercial practice everywhere in the world. It is treated as radical when a developing country attempts it. That asymmetry itself is worth naming. Third, the domestic investment corridor. If resource revenues are going to build domestic capacity rather than simply leaving the country, there needs to be an institutional mechanism to retain and deploy those revenues. Sovereign wealth funds, national development banks, and state-owned enterprises with genuine technical capacity. These are the vehicles through which resource revenue becomes national asset rather than national export. Fourth, the political will to sustain all of the above through the inevitable pressure that comes from the institutions and corporations whose interests are affected. This is perhaps the hardest part, because the pressure is real, it is financial, it is diplomatic. It is sometimes more than diplomatic. The history of governments that tried to assert meaningful control over their national resources is a complicated history. But it is also a history that, when read carefully, reveals that the pressure itself is part of the system. It is how the delay gets enforced. The pressure does not arrive after sovereignty is achieved. It arrives while sovereignty is being attempted. That is by design. This brings us to a point that this documentary wants to sit with for a moment, because it touches something that goes beyond economics. There is a psychological dimension to the delay, and it is, in many ways, the most durable part of the architecture. When generations of people grow up in countries that are defined in global discourse primarily by their debt, their instability, their governance challenges, their need for foreign investment and foreign expertise, when that framing is consistent and universal enough, it becomes internalized. Not universally, not completely, but enough. Enough that the vocabulary of dependence starts to feel like the vocabulary of reality. Enough that foreign investment starts to feel like a lifeline rather than a transaction. So enough that asserting national ownership starts to feel like a risk rather than a right. The bank logic works partly because it has a cultural counterpart. The story that gets told about these countries, the story of fragility, of need, of institutional weakness, is not simply descriptive. It is also prescriptive. It tells those countries what they are capable of and what they are not capable of. And it takes real intellectual and political courage to read that story and say, this is a framing. This is not fate. The wealth is here. The people are here. What is missing is control. And control is not something that anyone is going to hand over willingly. That is what the conversation around economic sovereignty ultimately asks. Not just, who owns the mine? But, who decided you could not own it? And when did you stop questioning that decision? The delay is a political choice dressed as a technical necessity. It is a power arrangement dressed as a development program, and the longer it goes unread for what it is, the longer it continues. The ledger is not hidden because the information does not exist. The contracts are filed. The royalty rates are calculable. The debt service obligations are on record. The arbitration clauses are in writing. The conditionality terms have been published in program documents for decades. The ledger is hidden because no one in a position of authority has been asked to read it out loud, in sequence, in a room where the people whose wealth is at stake are actually listening. This is what a genuine accounting of economic sovereignty would look like. Not a campaign slogan, not a foreign policy posture. It's an actual line-by-line examination of what was signed, what was lost, what was given, and what could be reclaimed. Legally, carefully, strategically, and without the pretense that the current arrangement is neutral. Ibrahim Traoré represented, for many people watching from outside Burkina Faso, not just a political figure, but a question. The question of what happens when a government decides that the delay is no longer acceptable, that the conditions are never going to be right, that sovereignty is not something you earn after you have proven yourself to the satisfaction of foreign creditors. It is something you exercise, or you do not exercise, and the consequences of exercising it, however complex, are at least consequences born of your own choices. That question does not have an easy answer. No serious analysis would pretend it does. The path toward genuine resource sovereignty, toward an economy that actually captures and retains and deploys the wealth that sits in the ground beneath its people, is full of real obstacles. Legal obstacles, financial obstacles, geopolitical obstacles. The pressure is real. The costs of confronting the system are real. But so is the cost of the delay. Every year that a royalty rate remains at a rate negotiated in a different era is a year of lost public revenue. Every year that a stabilization clause protects a foreign corporation from national law is a year in which that nation's parliament is nominally sovereign but practically constrained. Every year that debt service takes priority over domestic investment is a year in which the wealth beneath the ground does not become the wealth in the hands of the people above it. The bank logic behind the delay is not a mystery. It is a mechanism. Mechanisms can be understood, and what can be understood can, with enough political clarity and enough collective will, be changed. The first step is reading the ledger, not the headline number, not the investment brochure, the actual terms, the actual clauses, the actual flows. Because sovereignty is not delayed by geography. It is not delayed by history alone. It is delayed, precisely and deliberately, by a set of contractual, financial, and institutional arrangements that were built to produce exactly this outcome. The question is not whether you can afford to challenge those arrangements. The question is whether you can afford not to.